Utah politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. We do begin this morning with Salt Lake Tribune political columnist Robert Gehrke here to discuss the primary election, including the race for Utah County Attorney. Robert, great to have you back on the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, happy to be here.
Boy, this is just bizarre. Between you and I, we have decades of following Utah politics, and I can't think of anything like this. We have allegations of ritualistic sex abuse, murder, cannibalism. Have you ever seen anything like this?
No, I don't think anybody has. It's one of a kind, and pretty unexpected, I think, by and large. You know, you can't make this stuff up, I've never dreamed actually that a candidate would have to hold a press conference to deny he's a cannibal. It's kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, it definitely is that. Let's dig into it a little bit more, and let's start off with some bad blood that really has been boiling before this election cycle between the sheriff and the county attorney.
Yeah, there's been this tension between law enforcement generally in Utah County and County Attorney David Leavitt. Leavitt's been sort of a reformer. He's been working on justice reform issues. He said he's not going to pursue the death penalty. He revamped the county's special victims unit. And a lot of this didn't sit well with law enforcement down there. They feel like he doesn't have their back. The local fraternal order police, or the local police union, passed a no confidence resolution against David Leavitt. And so there's been this tension, and it goes back a number of years, but we're certainly seeing it boil over in this election cycle.
Let's get to the politics of this, because you argue in an article that you wrote on this story that this is a new level of politics. Talk about that.
Well, it's something we've never seen. I mean, you can't be a candidate and you can't prove that you haven't engaged in cannibalism. I mean, it's something that voters are going to have to look at for themselves. But yeah, like we said at the outset, it's something we've never seen before, and it sort of characterizes this knockdown, drag-out race that we're seeing with David Leavitt, the incumbent, presumably the front runner, running against Geoff Gray. Geoff Gray, he insists, and with some validity, that he's not the one who raised these allegations. It was sort of David Leavitt who voluntarily threw himself under the bus on this. And so, that complicates the dynamic in a lot of ways as well.
Yeah, and we should also mention that there are 3 candidates on the ballot, but one has dropped off, so it's just between Gray and Leavitt at this point.
Yeah. There's an interesting aspect to that too. Pomeroy, who is the other candidate who dropped off, works in David Leavitt's office, as does his wife. And so, you've got that dynamic as well. But he realized that he wasn't the candidate who had the best shot of beating David Leavitt, so he dropped out and endorsed Geoff Gray as the likely, the most likely to give Leavitt a run.
Right. Talk about how that might impact the race, though, given that he is still on the ballot.
Yeah, I mean, with this long window we have now with mail-in ballots, a lot of people, about 10%, 12% of people had already voted before Pomeroy made his decision to drop out. And so, depending on what turnout is like, that could make a significant impact. In primary elections, typically turnout's pretty low. And so when you have votes that are going to a candidate that end up not being counted because the candidate's dropped out, it could make an impact, because the people who are going to be voting for Pomeroy and Gray are people who are not Leavitt people. So,
exactly.
So they're already kind of splitting the vote, and I think votes that go to Pomeroy are a deterrence or hindrance for Geoff Gray's chances.
Right. So you mentioned Leavitt bringing it up himself, which he did, and I want to get into that a little bit more. But you also write about those that did bring up the allegations. This group. Talk about that.
Yeah. So the media had been hearing about rumblings about this allegation of ritualistic sex abuse in Utah County for months, frankly. And we'd never run with it because there's a high bar of proof, and all there really was this police report from years and years ago that made some just horrific allegations against a whole host of people in Utah County, some of them very prominent people in the community, and there was no way to validate and verify those. So nobody was really touching it, but there was that rumbling, that undercurrent there. David Leavitt apparently got a phone call from a political operative in Utah County before the sheriff released this sort of nebulous statement about reopening an investigation into ritualistic sex abuse, and the fingers started being pointed at David Leavitt. interestingly, one of the fingers that was pointing at David Levitt was somebody who lives on the internet, Arthur Knight, but there's very good reason to believe that this is Nicholas Rossi, who is a gentleman who faked his own death and fled to Scotland to escape a rape prosecution here in Utah. And so the Utah County Attorney's Office is in the process of trying to have him extradited back to the United States to face trial for that. So there's just all of these moving pieces and these moving machinations. Levitt, somewhat bizarrely, stood up in this press conference before anybody had actually said that he was named in this file or even hinted at that he was part of the subject of the investigation, and denied that he had ever engaged in ritualistic sex abuse or cannibalism, which is just, again, it's hard to fathom that happening, but also the fact that he sort of voluntarily issued a denial before anybody made the accusation was sort of dumbfounding.
Yeah, a couple things I want to hit on there. One, to add to the chaos in the circus is Knight talks to the local media over Zoom and does interviews with the local media denying the accusations against him. Yeah. But this point that you make about Levitt getting in front of it, this was first brought to my attention back in 2020 when he ran for Attorney General. So media has been looking into this for a long, long time. And as you mentioned, we never got to the point where we were going to go public with it. He came out in front of it and opened the floodgates, and then that gave us the opening to go ahead and start reporting on this story. Do you think that was the right move?
I think it was a huge mistake, obviously. If it was going to come out, it was going to come out, and you address it at that point. But to voluntarily issue that denial that then makes the accusation that hadn't been made the headline, I think was a huge mistake. And I think he also handled it poorly. I mean, he said that the accuser was a tragically mentally ill person. And, that's not the way to address that issue. I mean, obviously there is some reason to doubt some of the accusations in the report because they are so outlandish. But to just sort of issue that denial and characterize that person in that way and stigmatize mental illness, I think was a big mistake in its own right, much less the political aspect of then making the issue the cannibalism and the sex abuse.
Yeah, so I can't speak for other media organizations, but I can tell you for sure, we were on this for a long time and we weren't close to the point of going public with it until that happened.
And that's what I've heard from other media outlets as well.
Okay, you also make an argument that for the political opponents, they do have legitimate criticisms and they should really focus on those. Talk about that.
Well, it's been kind of interesting because we've seen Greg Hughes and Scott Burns. Greg Hughes is the lobbyist for the Utah Sheriff's Association. Scott Burns, the executive director of the Utah Sheriff's Association, formed this PAC that has been running some ads, put up a website, sort of highlighting some of the grievances with David Levitt. But as I mentioned, he revamped his special victims unit. That drew a lot of heat. He's had relatively high turnover in his office, and that was an issue that Pomeroy was a drum that he was beating because he said that having worked in the office, he's seen it firsthand. Some people might not like that he's not going to seek the death penalty in any cases, and that became an issue in the bomb trial that they had recently. And so, there are legitimate issues that I think voters in Utah County should be discussing. I don't know that ritualistic sex abuse and cannibalism, it should be at the top of the order, but it's the one that gets a lot of the headlines, and here we are talking about it as well.
Exactly. And you also mentioned in the article that you're somewhat concerned this could set a new standard moving forward. Is this now politics in Utah?
I mean, it's unfortunate that it could very well be. I mean, if this isn't off limits, what is off limits, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think we're venturing down a dangerous road, but we've seen it happening nationally too, where things that once were perhaps off limits are now fair game. The accusations have to be more outlandish, more headline grabbing, and more damaging, I think, to a candidate and harder for them to disprove. So, yeah, I think it's a road that we've been traveling down for some time nationally, and I think we're seeing it permeate Utah now as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, we're to the point where we're seeing ads now from national candidates going rhino hunting with rifles. Okay, Robert, great insight there. We're going to have you stick around because we're going to get into the races as well in just a bit. All 5 members